Good afternoon, everyone. As agreed at the GLA Oversight Committee meeting on the 25th of May, 2021, the Election Review Working Group will appoint its chair at its first meeting today. For the first item of business, I will therefore conduct an election for the chair for this working group in accordance with the GLA's standing orders. In the event of one candidate being nominated, I will declare the nominated candidate chair of the working group. A proposer and a seconder is required for each nomination. In the event of two candidates being nominated, I will ask for votes in favour of each candidate. Are there any nominations?
I would like to propose Assembly Member Sean Berry to chair the meeting, please.
I'd like to second that.
Thank you, Assembly members. Are there any other nominations? Then I declare that Assembly Member Berry is elected chair of the Election Review Working Group.
Great, okay, thank you very much, members. I'll get going with the meeting now. So item one was election of the chair. Now I need to move on to item 2, which is apologies for absence and any announcements. So can I start by welcoming the members that are here, the invited guests, the officers and the members of the public who've come to this meeting of the Election Review Working Group. We'll be putting questions today to our invited guests about the delivery of the 2021 Mayor and London Assembly elections, and we encourage anyone taking part in the discussions on social media to use the hashtag #LondonElections. So first of all, we have a few short items of formal business, and the first one is the apologies. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Len Duval, from whom Assembly Member Leonie Cooper will be substituting today.
Thank you very much. Second item is declarations of interest. Now, can I ask members to note the list of offices set out at item 3 of the agenda, ask if members have any other interests to declare, but also I think on behalf of all of us declare that by necessity we all had an interest in the elections, in that they elected us to the jobs we are now carrying out. So does everyone agree to declare that interest?
Declare that interest, yeah.
And you have any other interest in respect of the items on the agenda?
No, but I think we should be clear that they're not jobs, that we are office holders, and that although that might sound like a technical difference...
No, you're right, it's a role, strictly, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, we're office holders, not staff.
And we are here doing that role today. Right, item 4 is the membership. Can we note the membership of the working group as listed on the agenda? Thank you very much. And can we also note the working group's terms of reference as listed on the agenda?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. In terms of standing delegations, can we note the standing delegations of authority to me as chair of the working group as set out in the agenda and agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting? I don't think that's right, is it? It was the Oversight Committee that agreed our terms of reference.
Standing delegations are agreed at the Assembly.
Great, okay, well in that case can we note those? Okay, thank you very much. Item 7 is a tabled report from the Deputy Greater London Returning Officer on the elections. Can I ask the working group to note the contents of the report?
Noted.
And item 8 is our main item where we may draw on items, aspects of that report, and we'll be asking our questions to our guests. So can I welcome our guests here in the chamber? We have Alex Conway, who is the Deputy Greater London Returning Officer on behalf of the Greater London Authority. We've got Andrew Smith, the Chair of the London Branch of Electoral Administrators, and you're working for the London Borough of Wandsworth. Thank you very much. We've also got Richard Hewison, who is a candidate for Mayor for the Rejoin EU Party. Welcome. And also Mark, is that Hoff?
I don't mind.
Huff. Tell us.
How?
How? There you go. Lots of different ways to pronounce
Doesn't
that
mind
combination.
how
of
you
letters.
pronounce it.
That's right.
Mark Howe, who is the agent for Steve Callagher, who was a candidate for mayor for the Social Democratic Party. So thank you very much. And then joining us remotely, and I'm looking at you now, although you can't see that I'm looking at you, we have Mary Hartley, who is the Greater London Returning Officer who works here at the GLA. Right, thank you very much. So starting on our questions, looking at the report that we had and the information you've provided to us, I wanted to ask Mary and Alex, or whichever one of them wishes to answer, about the costs of this election. Because back in March 2021, the election budget was set at £21 million, but this increased by the end of the report to £38 million. So can you tell us where the additional funding came from, what it went to, and at what stage you realised that this increase was needed? I don't know which one of you wants to answer that.
Shall I start with a sort of an overview? Would that be helpful?
Mary, we can't hear you. 1 second.
Here.
Volume.
Can you hear me now?
You're
No.
very quiet.
Got no one in the tech box, have we?
Okay.
We can hear that you're talking. You're not on mute, but
I'm
No,
not on
the
mute.
volume, Mary, is the problem. Can you do anything your end?
So, no, I did a sound test 10 minutes ago and it was
No.
better.
yeah, you're not coming through on our speakers, Mary.
Okay, well, maybe Bo Ty needs to look at that. Maybe Alex can answer and take the
broadcasters.
first question while Bo Ty's
the technical team look at that. Can Alex answer any of those questions to begin with, maybe, while we wait?
Thanks.
Sorry, Mary.
I will do, Chair. So I would say that there are, perhaps to get one thing out, where did the money come from? I mean, it came from the reserves, and that was agreed through the 2021 budget process, and that which would have been brought before the Assembly at the time. So the sort of £10 million that came from there. The costs of the election fall entirely to the GLA. There's no subsidy from government in this case. Two main reasons why the election, why the price increased. Firstly, the very late postponement of the 2020 elections. It was on the 13th of March. That's just 5 working days before the start of the pre-election period. Meant that London elects, our contractors and the boroughs had already spent considerable sums preparing for the elections. And secondly, of course, the 2021 elections had to be COVID secure for voters, for candidates and agents, and for all staff, and that came at a considerable cost. So in relation to the sunk costs, if you like, of the 2020 elections, I mean, that related in part to electronic count voting systems development, testing, training, that could not be held over or reused for 2021. So, you know, equipment had already been hired, and when it came to think, you know, in 2020 we had already trained count staff for every London borough. We had tested the system. When it came to 2021, it was necessary to train staff again remotely in most cases, and to further test the system in light of security and other upgrades to systems components. So, I mean, we could have taken the view, for example, that we did a whole load of testing prior to the election, prior to the postponement in 2020, so we won't bother with 2021. I think given the experience of 2016, that would have been quite a high-risk strategy. So, you know, the retesting was necessary. That was the biggest item of kind of sunk costs, but there were some other significant ones as well, relating to the work we'd already done, boroughs had already done. Andrew will probably say more about that, you know, printing postal vote packs, poll cards, preparing polling stations, costs that we'd incurred hiring and preparing the 3 count centres, Alexandra Palace, Excel and Olympia. Costs we'd incurred for the election booklet. So again, the postponement was so late, you know, we'd already booked the paper, we'd already booked the printing slots for that statutory booklet, which we're obliged to produce. And even the election marketing campaign had started at that point. Costs that could, again, the election staff were all on fixed-term contracts, needed to be extended, by a further year. So those are all the sort of the sunk costs, if you like. The costs which relate to the COVID security, I guess we can split into sort of two categories. And the truth is we don't know those final costs yet, because boroughs aren't obliged to send in their final costs incurred until November this year. They can send them in earlier, but none have taken the opportunity to do so as yet. But what we estimate, so in terms of the costs that we incurred at the GLA, there was the cost of hiring our 3 venues for 2-day counts. Again, as you'll all recall, the original plan was to do 1 day only, but we extended to 2 for COVID secure reasons. Additional COVID protections, which many of you would have seen if you were at the venues, were put at the 3 venues, including the screens around each count, the PPE, and so on. And a roughly equivalent cost, we think, would be those costs associated with making polling stations COVID secure, in line with the Electoral Commission and government guidance that was issued at the time. That included sending out additional postal, or allowing for the possibility of additional postal votes. It included having a COVID marshal at each polling station, and of course having the relevant PPE and screens where boroughs so chose at each polling station. One thing I should say, having said that we have to meet the costs of those elections, it is the case that the government gave boroughs some additional money to cover costs of making polling stations and counts secure, and we're going to account for all of that in our kind of final reckoning with boroughs later this year.
So just to be clear, the boroughs claim back quite a lot of the costs from the GLA, but this time they've been given some by government, so the additional costs they charge back to you might not be as much. Does that mean that the cost might come in at less than 38 million?
Yes, it does. So again, we have to make an estimate. And to give you a clue, some of the figures, I think, Andrew may correct me if the money the Cabinet Office provided was just over £3 million, I think, to boroughs collectively. Some of those costs we've sort of taken directly because they relate to the count centres, which we were managing. We made some assumptions around, based on what boroughs basically claimed from us last time round, but potentially uprated by COVID. So, we're talking about most likely an 8-figure sum here, but obviously until we get the final figures, it's hard to know. So it might come down a bit, but not. I wouldn't want to suggest it would be a huge amount.
Thank you. Can we check if we've got Mary back?
I'm going to try again. Can you hear me now?
No, sorry, you're the same as you were. Is there anything? Okay, we're still investigating the issue, Mary. Sorry, we'll have to.
Okay. Well, okay. It worked 10 minutes ago. So.
Yeah, something's turned off at this end. I'm really sorry.
But we could hear Mary before the meeting started, actually.
Did, didn't we? Mm.
That's really peculiar.
It's really odd, yeah.
Because she was asking, she said, I heard her saying as I was coming up the stairs even, that would she be able to see us in the chamber?
Yeah.
So she was linked in at that point.
Well, not now.
Okay, we'll continue to work on that. I'll just ask Alex one more question in that case. You said the government had given some money to the boroughs. Have we tried to get any money from the government? For example, the big costs of hiring the venues for the extra days would seem like something we might be able to claim.
So we did put a request into government last year to reclaim some of those kind of sunk costs, noting that we're not reimbursed. We have not received a reply as yet. As I say, of some of that borough funding, we are intending to utilise some of that ourselves. But again, we haven't got a final reckoning yet. We will, I dare say, go back to government again, but I wouldn't, based on the lack of response so far and the fact that it's our statutory responsibility and not theirs. I mean, again, this is part of the reason why, unfortunately, we had to make a claim on the reserves last year.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we ask that in writing you provide to us a final sort of budget in rather than it just going through the regular budget process, if we could get a summary of spending with what was additional and what was refunded, just sort of quite clearly laid out for us so that we know what led to what extra costs, because it's not an inconsiderable amount of money at a GLA level, this. And just one final question then. Ahead of the pandemic, we already had a much higher budget for the 2020 elections compared with 2016. Can you just briefly tell us why already there was a higher expenses for this election, which was arguably set to be roughly the same?
Well, I'd say it was perhaps always likely to be a little bit more. So one key issue I'd say was that we went out to re-procure the electronic vote count system. So we used a system in 2012. We reused it in 2016. What's the word? And of course there were some problems there. And when we went to re-procure, which is one of the first things I was doing when I took on this role in 2017-18, we made the specification quite a lot more wider in scope than before in relation to the amount of testing that was going to be done. So we knew, I think we always knew, that the electronic vote counting would be a bigger component. That was the largest part of the explanation for the increase, I'd say. I mean, others are just the increase in the costs of things like that have, as I understand it, increased way beyond inflation. Things like the cost of the ballot paper, the cost of the postage to of sending a booklet to every voter. There's a good few reasons why the costs had increased from 2016.
Okay, that's really helpful, and we looked at that somewhat in the Oversight Committee as well, as things were going along. Yep. We were looking at that. Just to give Mary one more try to see if we can get Mary to contribute.
Me now?
Oh, we can hear you. That's great. Mary, would you like to add anything to what Alex has been telling us?
No, nothing to add so far. I'm sure I will later.
Thank you, Alex, for doing a comprehensive job there. I'm just going to pass over now to Assembly Member Prince for some more questions about costs, I think.
Thank you very much. So this is the GLA officer, so we start with Alex. What are the main cost drivers in delivering the 2021 elections? What would you say that were the main options for cost reduction, and what would be the financial impact of removing the e-counting process? What would be the operation and financial impact of using a single count centre?
You want to take that, Mary, or shall I?
Sorry, I thought Assembly Member Prince directed it to you. Happy for you to start.
Fine. No, let me.
If Mary wants to do it, I don't mind.
No, let me carry on as and then Mary will have further sort of points to add. So the two biggest cost drivers of this election or any election are, as we've already mentioned, the e-count system, which isn't just the e-count, it's also the ballot papers and everything else sort of tied to that, and the costs that boroughs then reimburse from us. I mean, taken together, that you're looking at more than just trying to do that, around 80% of the sort of election costs. Looking ahead to 2024, so I mean you're right. I mean we're looking now at different ways that we could modify costs. One interesting one is the use of whether we could have, for example, one count centre instead of three. It won't have escaped your observation that we're moving City Hall next to our biggest count centre. So we have been doing some sort of preliminary investigations as to what the costs might be should we shift to one count centre. That would be certainly logistically simpler. That's something that we're looking at now. Related to that, I should say, is the question as to whether you would count over 2 days, because then you could potentially have half the number of space, sort of use it twice over. So that's one thing we're looking at. We're also looking, so our e-count procurement with our contractor CGI said things went very well for 2021, and the contract, when we let it, has the option of an extension for 2024. So the obvious thing to do now is to invite CGI colleagues to quote for that, and they are in the process right now as we speak of doing so. If they are able to offer us a good price for an electronic count, that would clearly make that an attractive option, given that things worked well for 2021. If not, then we'll need to look at other options, which could be looking at other operators in the market, should there be any, or a manual count, as you say.
A couple of things there. You mentioned about going down from 3 centres to 1. What would be the resilience of that? I believe in a previous election, Crystal Palace was one of the options, and it had a power cut in Crystal Palace, which is obviously not foreseeable, but it did mean that the other 2 centres can carry on, and had that power cut continued, the operation could have been moved to one of the other centres. If we put all our eggs in the one proverbial basket, and you had a power cut at Excel, you'd be pretty finished, wouldn't you? Really?
Exactly. So these are the pros and cons that we need to look at, aren't they? Like, what's our resilience? What would our business continuity be if we did use one venue? I mean, you're right. I mean, that's where you've got to take a balance. I mean, on a balanced view on the risk versus cost that you'd be taking. Clearly, you could mitigate that risk by having another venue to hand, but then that's going to cost you a lot more money. So it's that classic risk versus cost analysis which we're doing now.
And from my own personal experience, there have been a number of issues with the electronic count, and it was suggested to me by an officer that there are things that happened which happen as a result of being electronic that make it a lot more difficult to double check stuff or to recount stuff, and that actually a manual count would be no slower. I don't know if it'd be more costly. So what are the pros and cons of having an electronic count against having a manual count? And I understand because of the excessive number of, I hope I'm not treading on someone else's toes here, the excessive number of candidates, that also caused a problem because it was an electronic count. I'm talking mayoral candidates.
Mayoral candidates. I mean, I guess by that, we'll probably come on to the subject later, won't we, of spoilt ballot papers and overvoting, which I think is a slightly...
I'm not asking about, I'm talking about costs more than...
Well, to maybe go back to first principles, because I think this is an issue the Assembly's discussed before of the sort of pros and cons of manual counts versus electronic. Would a manual count would certainly be slower than an electronic. I mean, that's the reason we have electronic vote counting in the first place. If our current voting system was maintained, I mean, think of it, if you like, as if you're doing a manual count under our existing system, you'd effectively be doing 4 counts in a row for constituency assembly members, London-wide assembly members, a first preference vote, and then a second preference vote. That's 4 separate counts. If you imagine you did those all as quickly as possible, you're talking about potentially 3 or 1 day per count would be 4 days, wouldn't it? Maybe you could speed that up a little bit, but it's definitely slower. That's why we do electronic vote counting in the first place. The costs, well, again, there's pros and cons. You'd be working it in different ways, wouldn't you? A manual count would mean a sort of reverts to constituencies, most likely. Again, something you'd need to, so you would have perhaps sort of 14 different counting points. So it would work in a different way. And again, as I say, there's no decisions taken as yet on about the best way of taking these things forward, not least because we're mindful that the government has said that they may make changes to the mayoral voting system before 2024, though again at this point in time we can't know for sure whether that will happen or not.
Okay, do you mind if I just go back to the cost? And on the cost, again, Mary, perhaps you should answer this one, but please feel free to push the ball between you. We knew obviously that we had the £21 million budget. We also knew that there were, to use your phrase, sunk costs with the postponement of the election. Why was that £21 million not revised at that point? Because clearly you weren't going to be able to deliver it for 15 million, were you? Mary, do you want to do that?
So I'm not quite so yes, we had a budget for 2020 actually, which was 26 million, not 21, but that's what was the final budget for 2020. Right. Then of course it got postponed. So we then had to quickly work out how much of the work that had been done could we salvage and how much would we have to put aside in sunk costs. And then, of course, we had to sort of recalculate what 2021 would cost us. And we pulled down some money from the election reserve to cover that cost. So that's how we did that in the budget.
Right. But that didn't add up to £38 million, though, did it?
Well, the combination of the original budget was 26. Then we had the costs related to the sunk costs.
Yeah.
And then we have the COVID costs on top. The sum of that is at maximum 38 million. And as you were discussing earlier, depending on what the borough returns are precisely when they come in November, we may come in under that total 38.
Yeah. I think the point I'm trying to get to, sorry, probably didn't make it very clear, so I apologise for that, is that we have some reports that, certainly from a borough level, that they were complaining that the budget was a bit tight and that sort of made it a bit difficult for them to make certain decisions. I mean, what point did you agree let's call it the £38 million, or at what point was it identified that there would be sufficient funding? Because the indications we're getting from the boroughs is that they were not made aware of the additional funding and that they were being held working within the existing envelope.
So I'd be interested to know where that's come from. I don't recognise that at all. I have always been clear, we've always had a very clear agreement with boroughs that, and it's the same agreement that government has with local authorities who deliver general elections, which is that you will be reimbursed for reasonable costs incurred and proved for each election. And so we had costs agreed for 2020 in these so-called MRAs, maximum recoverable amounts. Those were agreed with the boroughs. When it became clear that COVID was going to increase those costs, but we couldn't tell by how much, I was very clear directly with the constituency returning officers and borough returning officers that the principle continued to apply, that they would be reimbursed for costs deployed on our behalf. And, you know, those were potentially substantial because of all the work done to make polling stations safe and the rest of it. Now, as we've heard, government actually did pass some money directly to boroughs for COVID-related costs. But I have also always said to the boroughs that if that doesn't cover their entire COVID-related costs, we will reimburse them, which is why we are working on this maximum 38 million. So obviously you're not going to tell me, you can't tell me, But that, I don't recognise that at all. We have been always very clear with boroughs that they would be reimbursed for costs.
Well, perhaps I'll send you what I've got.
Yeah, no, that would be helpful because
Yeah, no.
somebody feels that way. I mean, it would be good to understand who, and then I could talk to them.
Okay. All right. So,
Assemblymember Prince, can you share that with the rest of the committee as well? Because I don't think it's in the papers that we've
well,
seen.
it wasn't the papers I read.
Okay.
So,
I thought that was more that they were saying that they thought that London Elects was under-resourced rather than themselves. And that's one of Assemblymember Bakari's coming
well,
up
maybe
questions.
that's where we are.
Yeah, anyway, be interesting to know if they were trying to operate.
Okay. So, we'll leave that at that. That's fine. And then if we move on to my final question, which is, I'll ask it of Alex. Do you think that the £10,000 contribution from candidates covers the cost of election material sent to all voters? And how much would be saved if the GLA only sent out to each household rather than to each voter, or if it was made fully online?
Well, the answer is it doesn't get you very far. So the just reminding myself of the total costs of, and again we'll be sharing some of these figures as the chair requested, but the total cost of the booklet this time round was in the vicinity of £2.8 million. We had a record number of mayoral candidates, 20, of whom 17 opted to be in the booklet.
Right.
So that was a total, and they don't all have to be, the guys who are on YouTube, used their own publicity methods, I guess, outside of that. So we had and so they contributed 170,000. So it's a drop in the ocean, frankly. You're right. One of the areas that we would like to look at, and we're not that there are other mayoral combined authorities are in the similar position of being obliged to produce a booklet which goes to every single voter, which means that every year we get letters from people saying, why have I been sent 4 copies of the same thing? So it doesn't seem particularly, although of course it's all printed on recycled paper and so on, it's not especially ecologically sound in terms of a way of doing it. It feels a bit old school. I think you could certainly save a lot of money if we moved it online, but perhaps had hard copies made available to libraries and other places where people might find that useful. Failing that, moving to 1 per household is an area where, again, we've discussed this with government before, and other combined authorities are of the view that that would be a useful step. It wouldn't save, it would save us probably, I haven't got the map yet, a few £100,000 worth in terms of postage and printing. It wouldn't save a huge amount making that change, but it would make, I think, perhaps more sense to the taxpayer and the public.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Cooper has a follow-up question before we move on, I think, on this specific.
Yes, thank you. We're talking about, obviously, I think we understand why the costs were additional this year because the 2020 election was cancelled so late. And then when we finally did run it, there were all the additional costs relating to COVID security. So I think probably the cost for 2020, 2021 was much higher than usual. But we're talking here about reducing the costs. And I believe the budget is pretty much what it was as if there hadn't been those additional costs. So it would be a budget of about 20 million rather than towards the 38 million actual cost this particular time. So in terms of the savings that you're talking about, so perhaps 1 booklet per household and other areas combining to 1 count, would you be ring fencing any savings from those savings into other areas? Because Assemblymember Prince referred to the fact that the electoral returning officers felt that in some ways there were lacks that could be improved. So would you be ring fencing it to keep it within the election process for improvements elsewhere, or would it just go back into the sort of general GLA budgets?
Those would be decisions, I guess, for the Executive Director of Resources and others, but I wouldn't assume, I think as with all the budget generally, the assumption is we just try and do things as effectively as we can, and that ring fences are the exception not the rule. And just as a reminder, when it comes to the sort of costs of EROs and so on, as the GLRO just said, boroughs' costs are reimbursed in full there. So they're
I think, Chair, if we're going to be looking at cost savings, then we do need to consider where any savings achieved, where that money goes to. And it would be good for...
It would make sense for us to make recommendations.
I think so.
Lines, yeah. Just one
Thank you.
quick check. The booklet going to all voters, that's part of the law at the moment, is that correct? So we'd have to change the GLA Act?
yes, and, so,
Okay.
and other. But again, there are electoral reform bills going through Parliament at the moment, so I would say the possibility is there, should the government find time to make these legislative changes.
There's an opportunity to make that suggestion, isn't there? Thank you very much. Right, so just to let the other guests know, we've got one more short section of questions going to the GLA officers about practical matters, and then we'll be moving on to you. So won't take very much longer, just to let you know. The next section of questions is to Assembly Member Bakari.
Hi, I'm going to be talking a little bit about resourcing and the delivery. There was quite a lot of feedback coming back from the boroughs suggesting that London elects were under-resourced and the staff were feeling quite pressured and stretched and stressed. And there were warnings about this prior to the election vote. So could you go through some of the challenges that you had when it came to resourcing? Could you talk a little bit about why maybe some of the warnings beforehand may have not actually been raised and heeded in advance, and perhaps what you will do next to make sure that those challenges and those issues that you had don't happen again in 2024?
Shall I take that?
Yeah, sure.
I'll at least start, and then I can pass the ball to Alex as well. So, just stepping back, I think we started with a very good resource plan. We took on board the recommendations, actually, that the equivalent panel had made back in 2016, and made a number of changes. And of course, we ended up with actually myself as Greater London returning officer, with at the time getting on for 15 years experience running elections as a returning officer. And I think that hadn't been the case before. We brought in a programme director, a very experienced elections manager, actually with a career in a London borough beforehand. And of course, we brought in a specialist IT person to be our eyes and ears around the e-count. We also thought very hard, again, about some of the lessons from 2016 into the resourcing. So I think we went in well resourced. We have to come back to COVID, of course, because we didn't then find ourselves delivering a normal election. We found ourselves delivering an election like no other. And I think everybody in the system, well, of course, from yourselves as candidates to agents, to all of our colleagues in the boroughs and our colleagues in our suppliers, we're dealing with this sort of unprecedented situation, which stretched us all. At times it did feel as if it was stretching us to the limit, but with dedication and hard work and everything else, we got there. And I think that's I think we have to start this conversation with that. We were being stretched and challenged like never before. I think elections are always incredibly difficult, stretching, stressful times, and as well. So I think that we had done our best to be ready with the resources. I think we had taken on board a number of the recommendations that had been made, and then I'd made my own judgments as sort of the current GLRO, again working with constituency returning officers and borough returning officers. And if you think too, others will talk about this, but we were stretched at the GLA. People in the boroughs were doubly, triply stretched, because of course many of those election staff had also been doing other COVID work as well, and then had returned to the matter of the elections and registration from helping with the COVID response. I mean, an entirely different context for this election. So that's where I would start with this. In terms of what we would do differently, I mean, I think, I hope this is going to come across, you know, we're absolutely up for listening to any recommendations. I think there are some areas where we ended up particularly stretched, and we would definitely want to shore those areas up next time. So there is an awful lot of communication with passing of information, data requests going out to all boroughs right the way through the process, but also in a very concentrated time as we ramp up to the election itself. And I think we definitely next time we'll put some more resource into borough liaison and borough communication. I think that's definitely what we would need to do. I also think we can be a little bit smarter in terms of how information flows. So, you know, it no longer flows on paper, of course. We used email quite a lot. That's now old-fashioned. We need to be thinking a little bit more about some decent portals, I think, for the exchange of information and the upload of information and things like that. So I would definitely say that was an area that we would look to improve.
And there'll be some sort of monitoring of their well-being while you're doing that, I expect.
Sorry, what I wouldn't want to do is build up a lot of extra resource for a non-COVID election. So that's the thing we need to be careful of.
Right, well, thank you. The boroughs have advised that the electoral administrator had too great a workload and remit. Would you consider additional resources for that role as well and to increase resilience in 2024?
Yes, we definitely need to think about increased resilience because, as I said, as I hinted, you know, it stretched us all almost to the limit this election.
Would you like to add anything to that, Alex? Or you?
No, I think maybe the only point just to reflect on is that, and as some Assembly member colleagues will recall, you know, the first few elections at the GLA were delivered by a sort of dedicated team that was sort of there all year round. For 2016, a new approach was taken, kind of involving a wider group of officers, and I think the feeling was that had worked well, but some of the recommendations that Assembly members made last time round were that we needed dedicated staff in post, and that was a recommendation we took up with the appointment of the posts that Mary referred to earlier, the sort of technical specialist and the sort of programme director. I mean, I think that the good news is that they are on board to work for the 2024 election as well, so we have some welcome continuity of people who, again, will be sort of doing things the second time round. So I think that all helps a bit. And it's a tricky one because there's no getting away from the fact that, you know, elections are by their nature very, very stressful things, and the work that's ramped up in the as I now know from personal experience in the sort of particularly the sort of 6 weeks, 2 months before is very intense. So I think, as Mary says, you know, we'll try and sort of learn the lessons and think about how we can spread things a little better. But at the same time, it's a tricky thing to plan for. It's something, isn't it? It takes a long-term planning, and then there's a lot of work that needs to be done in a short period of time right near the end.
So let's move on to the count. The stakeholders have suggested that processes following the day of the count did not run smoothly because of technical issues. What will be done in the future to streamline the counting and declaration processes, and why is it so complicated? Why does it take so much time? Can you explain a little bit more about that? Either Mary or yourself.
Well, shall I kick off again? I'm sorry not to be in the chamber. My daughter has COVID, I think, as you all know, so that's why I'm not with you. And I know it's not making it particularly easy. I mean, I think it takes a lot of time because we think we counted this time 8 million ballot papers. So we mustn't lose sight of the scale of this exercise. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing, actually, the e-count system worked extremely well this time, and the 2-day count helped with that, although it introduced some new risks around the system, which were all properly tested and mitigated. So that's not to say there weren't some minor issues in some of the counts, and I wouldn't say that by no means all of the counts. There were some minor issues in some of the counts, which I know were very frustrating on the ground for people that happened to. But in the general scale of the event over the 2 days, what we're trying to achieve in the time we've got, actually only really minor things occurred. That I think that's important to say that. So, there were some counts that had technical problems at the beginning and weren't able to start quite so quickly. There was another count that had a trouble uploading its result to us at the count centre. I remember that because I was sitting at the central centre waiting for it. There were some other minor issues. So I said I don't want to downplay how frustrating those were for particularly borough colleagues suffering those, but they were in the scale of things minor pieces. Now, again, they're all catalogued. We will learn from those as we learned last time. If we do end up working again with the same contractor, then that will be easier to do as well in terms of taking that learning straight through to the next count. Alex might want to add to that. So I think we mustn't lose sight of the scale of this, and actually it's overall it did, the software and the system absolutely did what was asked of it.
You can add on if you wish, but
no, that's fine. No.
Well, can we move on to the night itself, with in terms of security and candidates and agents who were feeling fairly unsafe during the night, and that was due to protests that were taking place outside, the situation inside as well, where there were individuals who were refusing to wear masks and follow guidance and rules. People were asking for support and help and information, and there wasn't very much, unfortunately, and it did cause quite a lot of stress and strain on those people who had been waiting all night, and at the end of a very long election period, and you can imagine how that must have felt. Could you tell us a little bit about what perhaps went wrong that night in terms of security? Why did that happen, and how we can improve things for next time? I'm happy to go with either Mary or Alex for that.
Yes, so again, I'm happy to take that. So I can talk about what was going on inside City Hall, because that's where I was. And I can talk a little bit about the wait and the reasons for that. When you're talking about the outside, we maybe Alex can talk about that a little bit as well. So I think, again, we'd set off to count over 2 days, and I had made it clear that if we possibly could, we would announce the results on the Saturday evening, but may still go to Sunday morning. And as you would have observed, on Friday, we managed to complete the 7 counts, quite late in the evening, but not too bad. Saturday was starting earlier, so we started off confident that we could finish off on the Saturday night. There came a point at about 6 p.m. where ultimately I had to take the call as to whether or not we were going to stand everyone down and say, actually, we're not going to be able to declare tonight, we're going to shift to Sunday, or no, we are going to declare. And I took the view that we were close enough to finishing to go for the declarations on Saturday night. In the end, my view was actually it would be in everyone's interest to do that. But when I made that call, of course, not all the counts were finished. Some people have said to me, well, you look how far, because City and East were the last one to finish, look how far City and East were off. Why did you call it at 6? Well, but what I knew that not all observers would know was actually what was happening at City and East, and they were going to pick up some considerable pace, and we were going to get there. But in the end, it did take longer, and there's always then a process to go through. And I cannot risk anything other than the accurate right result being declared. So having called it for Saturday night, then the race was on to try and get the results declared as soon as we can. Our problem was because of COVID, if you think back to where everything was back in May, we could not just pack City Hall full of people, as has happened every time. So we had this position where we had to limit people who were there. We had to bring people in for the mayoral result first, and then keep people waiting for the London Assembly list member result later. Ended up having to keep people outside. I apologise for that, but in the end, we got the results out just after midnight in terms of some of you coming onto the stage as Assembly list members. I could have made the other call. I could have said at 6, okay, well, we're giving up on any declaration on Saturday night. We'll reconvene on Sunday, everybody. But I fear I couldn't have won which way I called it. So once we'd called it for Saturday night, we did our best to deliver it as soon as we could.
There was still an issue with security, with people coming in with extra people and larger teams, and just the fact that there was the situation where there was one room for candidates and agents, and in a room where there wasn't really much distance. There were people wearing masks and some people who weren't. Is there a question here about security, and that there could have been some improvements in that particular area?
Well, I'll ask Alex to comment. We ran a very tight ship at City Hall, and in fact at the count centres, in terms of who was allowed in. We paid an awful lot of attention to that for obvious reasons. I am certainly not aware that people got into City Hall who shouldn't, if that's what you're suggesting, Assembly Member. But in terms of the process, there of course was a moment where I had to get the candidates and the agents into one room to consult them on the results. That's what I must do by law, and so at some point we had to get people into the same room to do that. We had spots on the floor to distance people appropriately. But there's a point of consultation on the result, which is only for the ears of agents and candidates and no one else. And so that's the bit where we got everybody into the room together. Again, we thought long and hard about how to do that and how to keep people safe for that short time.
Alex, do you think there could have been some improvements, and especially in the way that particular room was organised and how people were feeling in that room that night?
I wondered if as Mary said, I am very confident that there was no issue around people being there who shouldn't have been there. And actually, one of the things that I was doing on the night at one point, I recall, was removing the odd person who didn't have the right wristband and so on. So we did that. I think maybe perhaps what you're alluding to, which is the case, is that not all candidates and agents were wearing masks. Now, the advice to candidates and agents couldn't have been clearer. That they were required, people had them on, then some were taking them off. As you'll know, there were people who campaigned on the basis that they believe that mask wearing is wrong. The choice you have, I guess, at that particular moment in time, isn't it, where as the GLRO says, you have a legal obligation to get something done, you need it done as quickly as possible. Would it have, had we, again, we didn't have, you're doing this stuff in real time, you don't have time to discuss it on the night, but had we, for argument's sake, said, well, we're not going to do this until everybody puts a mask on, and then have people kicking off saying, well, I'm not going to do it, the net result would be, this is my personal feeling, that you would have had, delay, you'd have had publicity, you'd have given people the publicity that they perhaps were craving, and I'm not sure that would have been the best outcome. So it's suboptimal that people were not obeying the rules. I think the thing that we tried to do was to get everything done, as Mary says, as quickly as possible. It would have been good to have seen better mask compliance.
communicating as well would have been better, because a lot of people were just waiting around waiting to know what was happening for quite a long time, and in that kind of situation it's quite stressful, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we, as people may recall, I mean, I did a little bit of coming out of the room where we were waiting for that final. Again, I think we'd all have loved it if that final constituency could have been dealt with half an hour earlier, but everything's got to be done correctly. I did kind of pop out and apologise for the delay, which I appreciate is not what people wanted to hear. I'd have loved to have been able to say things like, I apologise today and I guarantee you will have the result in X minutes, but that would also have been a potential recipe for disaster. So, as Mary says, it was a balancing act. I think we really wanted to get the result in that evening, and we achieved it, given all the other COVID-related issues we faced. That's no mean feat. It would have been nice if we could have done things all that little bit quicker, but equally, we have to be sure that the counts are ultimately correct. And when I look at the odd scare story of stories of results around the country where something was done incorrectly, where something wasn't, then I kind of think we were better safe than sorry in spending that little bit of extra time ensuring that the counts were correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Curry. I just have one final question to Mary about the arrangements inside City Hall. The re-elected mayor had different arrangements made in terms of where he was expected to wait, the number of guests he had. Can you give us the basis for that? Was it because he'd been at that point identified as the eventual winner, or was it more to do with security implications because of the range of candidates that he would otherwise have had to mix with?
Primarily security.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheers. I'm moving on now to Assembly Member Cooper, who has some questions for some of our other guests.
Actually, just before we move on, can I just say something about Olympia? Because we were mainly talking there, I felt, about the central count. And there was a real problem with facilities. And by facilities, I mean access to toilet facilities and also places where people could get refreshments. Almost all of the areas were cordoned off for the count staff. And obviously, it's a very long day for people who've come along to see the outcome of their count. And that didn't just include assembly members and their agents and their guests, but we also had multiple by-election counts going on as well. And in the area where people could access refreshments, because they weren't allowed to go into the main area of refreshment because that was cordoned off for the count personnel, there were about 6 chairs. Now, I'm not going to bother to work out how many people were trying to access those 6 chairs. It was extremely hot. Some of the people who were there were, older and actually needed to sit down. I thought the facilities were really most inadequate in Olympia. Is there anything that can be done to make it more comfortable for people who are going to be there? Because whilst I accept that there was probably a sort of pent-up number of by-elections because we hadn't had any for, a whole year, there are pretty much always by-elections, whenever the count is being held. Perhaps not as many as that. And I thought it was really unacceptable. There were some people who were really struggling on that day. And of course, in Olympia, the facilities are up. You had to go up in a lift or upstairs, so it was very hot. And of course, you go and sit under the ceiling, it was even hotter.
So the 2 count centres that I was able to visit today were Excel and Alexandra Palace. So unfortunately, I'm not able to comment directly on Olympia. What I observed at Excel and Alexandra Palace was, as you say, where there were people, often candidates, agents, or people with particular needs or mobility-related disabilities that appropriate arrangements were made. I know that in some cases in advance we arranged for wheelchairs, chairs, and so on to be made available. So I guess I apologise if at Olympia that the sort of arrangements that I certainly saw at Excel at Alexandra Palace, where there were chairs there and about, and again, of course, we had to bear in mind the need for 2-metre social distancing and proper gangways and so on, but people seem to find a way to make that work. It may be that the Olympia space, from memory, is a little bit more awkward by comparison with Excel and Alexandra Palace, so I don't know if that was an issue there or not.
There was a huge amount of space and there were no chairs for people to sit on, and people at that point were still feeling, I think, that they didn't really want to go and move around externally. I mean, a lot of places outside of Olympia weren't even open, so it was all a bit awkward for some people in terms of getting hold of refreshments as well. But I mean, I do think if there are going to be counts in multiple venues, then they do need to make sure that people are properly catered for, particularly if the weather is very hot, and also that there are adequate seating arrangements, because it is an incredibly long day that goes on. I mean, obviously for the count staff it's even longer, but it's pretty long even if you arrive at midday. Some of the counts at Olympia weren't finishing until 7 or 8 in the evening. That's 8 hours.
Well, I think we were pretty clear with candidates and agents before that the normal catering arrangements would not be in place because of COVID, and that people would unfortunately, I mean, this is the difficulties of holding an election in a pandemic, that people would need to. I think the advice was, bring, there'll be some very sparse things, but otherwise, bring your own food and drink, or limit your visit. I mean, this is just an unusual circumstances in which to be holding an election.
Absolutely, but I don't think we actually encourage people to bring their own furniture to sit on. So I do think more chairs would have been very welcome. However, moving on from that, I do want to come to the other stakeholders' experiences. So I'm very happy to particularly hear, I think, from Andrew Smith with regard to the borough perspective, and then from Richard and Mark as to the sort of candidate stroke agent experience. So sorry we've kept you waiting a bit before we came to you. Now is your moment, and we will continue to pester you for the rest of the meeting, no doubt. How well did you feel, and I'm going to start with Andrew and then move on to you afterwards, how well did you feel that London Elects performed and worked with key stakeholders, both in the months leading up to polling day, then on polling day itself, and then on the day of the count, which was obviously both the Friday and the Saturday, and then with the declarations, which obviously took place at different times. So that's a series of different activities. I'll start with you, Andrew, if I may, and lovely to see you.
Likewise. To be honest, I'm not really sure, as an electoral administrator, that we're best placed to answer the last section there, because we don't really have a lot of dealing directly with London Elects on the day or for the counts, because we've done everything by then. So most of our work, a good 95% of our work is all the lead-up stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think, as I've said, I'm the chair of the electoral administrators in London, so what I've tried to do in this short report is just set out an overview, a consensus where we can find it. Obviously, people will have their own different views about things, but generally, overall, I think that they performed incredibly well. It was a unique set of circumstances with COVID, and obviously that, put a skewer through everything. But, as we've said, we did feel that there was an awful lot left on particular individuals to deal with. To be fair, I think Mary has already absolutely identified and highlighted where some of those weaknesses were around the communication and the sort of collation and sharing of data. One of the problems is you have 33 boroughs all trying to communicate with one person all the time, and which means that that person's then having to respond to 33 people, and it's a very, very difficult job when they're also then liaising with contractors, some of whom were new. So it just felt like on this particular occasion, more than we've witnessed before, there was an awful lot of pressure in London Elects, and it felt slightly under-resourced. But I'm sure, a lot of that could be down to COVID.
Thank you. So the same question then, and I'll start with Richard and then move on to Mark. So, the work with the key stakeholders in the months leading up to polling day itself, the count, and then the declaration. How did you feel that London Elects did on all of those different areas?
Well, first of all, just let me thank you for inviting me here today to do that. It's fascinating to hear different accounts of the same event and hear the different experiences people have had. I think you guys obviously have a lot more experience of elections than myself, but I have to say I was blown away by how effective I thought London Elects was. from the very first bit. Well, I thought when I came with my nomination papers, it would be all bureaucracy. All the London Elects team were really keen, I felt, to sort of help and make sure, rather than be a barrier, that they got you through the process, which I'd like to put on record my thanks to all the staff for that. I don't know if it's appropriate to mention staff names or not.
Mary, any views on if it's in a good context?
It is in a good context.
I think compliments
We wouldn't like you to criticise anyone by name.
No. I'd just like to say, particularly Lee Goddard and Lauren Doherty really went beyond, in my view, in terms of, to me it seemed that their aim in life was to make sure that every candidate got into the election. So at the start I was very impressed with that. Equally, in terms of the help in getting all the documents for the booklet, that was really, really helpful as well. The constant briefings and updates, I felt I was always aware of what was going on, and particularly things like the consultation with the Metropolitan Police. I thought that was incredibly well organised, and I felt that that was done in such a way that all mayoral candidates would have been able to exercise their responsibilities appropriately. And I think the other thing I would just say is, as one of the, shall I say, 16 less likely candidates to win in that election, you were made to feel that you were being treated just as seriously as all the other candidates, which again, I'd like to thank the staff for. I had a completely different experience of the election evening and the count, I think, to what was given here. To me, particularly the election evening, struck me as very, very well orchestrated. I did feel myself that I knew what was going on at all times. It's probably because I got little experience of these elections, so it just felt like everyone knew what they were doing and guiding appropriately. And Mary, I felt the way that you kept us informed at the election and explained everything throughout the count and orchestrated the march to the stage and that sort of thing was really, really well done. And I certainly do relate to the point made by the Assembly member about the masks and the issue of masks there. There were a number of candidates who were determined not to wear masks on that evening, and I guess there's always a tricky balance between democratic right to actually put your view and public safety. I did feel that most of the unmasked candidates at least had the respect to keep the appropriate social distance, but that was my experience on that particular evening. The count itself, I only attended the Olympia account. I have to say I didn't try to get food, so I can't relate to what comments were made there. But in terms of the actual arrangement of the count, the transparency of the information, the guidance around the systems, I thought that was, again, really, really good, very well explained, good, clear routes. Perhaps to pick up on a couple of things that have been said, I think when Alex mentioned the 10,000 drop in the ocean in terms of the contributions there. From the point of view of candidates not from the main parties, I think the committee should appreciate what a barrier to entry this sort of thing is. We put a 10,000 deposit in the first place for people to get into the election. Now, if you're in a party like mine, which has virtually no resources and we are very much, you want to stand, you pay your deposit, that 10,000 is not trivial. And then to put another 10,000 for someone who's already a candidate to actually have their voice heard in the election, I think is possibly an inappropriate barrier. Now, I'm lucky enough to have been reasonably, I'm not rich, but moderately successful in London life. And are we really saying that the only people who should be able to stand for mayor and communicate are either those from the big parties or those with deep pockets?
Yeah, well, we might come back to that sort of issue, but we were trying to focus on London elects and their performance rather than the issue about the deposit.
Oh yes, yes.
And there's a different argument that says, for example, that maybe 20 candidates, some of whom appear to be doing it for entirely frivolous reasons and nothing to do with the election. Perhaps the deposit should be higher to create more of a barrier to stop that. But we're going to come back to that in a slightly different area. I'm going to actually move from you, if you don't, I'm going to hold the thought though. I'm going to move to Mark. And Mark, I think your candidate was called Stephen.
Steve Keller.
Are you able to speak sort of from the candidate perspective or just purely from the agent perspective?
I'll speak mainly from the agent perspective, if that's okay. I think the Social Democrat Party were one of those 16 parties that Richard just referred to, who had very little chance of winning. A small party, not many resources. I wasn't involved in the count. Steve was there, I wasn't. But just a couple of observations from the point of view of a deputy nominations officer. First of all, I totally agree with Richard. Lee and Lauren were absolutely superb. We were treated with utmost respect. They were very, very helpful. Everything was extremely well explained. They gave us plenty of time to go through everything. Appointments were kept on time. That made a big difference to us. And this was a completely new experience for me, as well as for the party. Two issues seem to make things a bit difficult. I'm not expecting the electoral rolls to be centralised, because I understand there's a data protection issue, but it would help enormously if they were standardised, because every single borough has a different format for accessing the electoral rolls. I had to download WinZip programs for some boroughs, others it was just on a PDF, others it was on Word, all different formats, trying to get hold of the electoral rolls from the different boroughs to get the electoral numbers. I don't know if that could be looked into, but that would make life a lot easier for, smaller parties with not so large admin resources or full-time admin staff. And the other thing I suppose that concerned me was just the security of the nominations, because we were very, very thorough. I went all over London personally getting signatures from people actually at their doorstep, so I knew they lived there, they were on the electoral roll, all the numbers matched up. But I don't know if those nominations are ever checked. So it's perfectly possible for somebody to access the electoral rolls and then just get somebody else to sign on someone's behalf. And if they're not checked, then that is possibly open to abuse. So I don't know if that issue could be looked at as well.
Okay. So
other than that, all very, very positive, and totally agree with what Richard said there. Particular praise for Lee and for Lauren.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Those are probably the points about the electoral rolls might be something more for Andrew and his colleagues to think about in terms of the way that things are done in different boroughs. But I suspect that might be a hiding to nothing, in the sense that most boroughs sort of rather guard their ability to run their affairs in their own way, because they are 32 entirely separate boroughs, and of course the City of London, and what's great in Merton is something we couldn't possibly do in Croydon. I'm speculating, but I would imagine that would be the attitude probably of most of the boroughs, unless it's something that they've already linked up to do, which they have done in a few places. Do you think that the processes and the technology that was made available by London Elects, I mean, you had no problem, it sounds as though you felt everything sort of went pretty smoothly, apart from those issues that you just identified. So the electronic count, submitting the information, keeping you updated, all of those processes all worked well. There was no problems with any of that.
Yeah, all of the centrally organised things I thought were very thorough, so well done to everybody here. It was just very difficult to actually get hold of individual boroughs' electoral officers. In some cases, websites just said the office is closed due to COVID. Phone calls, emails, it was quite laborious. And then in addition to that, there were all the different formats. If they all just made the electoral rolls available on a PDF, and they all did that, it would make life enormously easy for nomination officers.
I'm going to bring Andrew back in, and he may or may not wish to comment on the points that you've just been raising, Mark. But I'm going to ask all three of you, and so I'll start with Andrew, and you can refer back to those points if you wish. But my question also is, what would you say the key areas for improvement in the conduct of the future mayoral and assembly elections?
If I could just answer Mark's question, so you should be able to just request it all in the same format. I'm very surprised you struggled there, because you could get it all in Excel if that's what you wanted. I can't answer why certain boroughs weren't able to respond to your request. Everybody should have been available on email, but yeah, we normally supply data in Excel to everybody, so I'm surprised by that. But we do all have different softwares, so maybe that was the issue. I think the key thing is to as we've said already, really, is to I think from an administrator's perspective, being selfish about it, is to ensure that we, as we always have been, you know, are very much involved at a granular level with the sort of building of the strategies around the whole delivery, you know, having more involvement with all the different contractors that we deal with, to see that our input does bear fruit, and to ensure that we are able to communicate more effectively, because I think the current scheme is, you know, everyone's mentioned Lee, so it's Lee that I was referring to as well, that you know, it's too much going through one individual, so that certainly seems to be an area that needs to be looked at. Using technology and data better in terms of communicating with boroughs as well, I think will help us all, particularly if in 2024 it's combined with the parliamentary election, because a lot of the goodwill that's always there from boroughs will still be there, but the capacity for us to help in the way that we always have done will be diminished, because we will be stretched to our own limits delivering a parliamentary election if that's what ends up happening.
I think we might come back to 2024 later on in our questions as well. Richard or Mock, is there anything you'd like to add to? I mean, obviously you've already made some points about key improvements. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about key improvements?
I mean, I have to say, overall, I thought a really good job was done. I'm trying to think of anything that surprised me or that I was unaware of. I think perhaps the only thing that took me by surprise, which, and again, it's not really London Elected's responsibility, but I was quite surprised when the BBC suddenly told me I had a party election broadcast in 10 days to prepare for it. So I think sort of some information to smaller candidates as to what to expect, and also I would just add on that, I think another candidate for mayor, who shall remain nameless, will be a little bit disappointed because they didn't know the criteria and failed to qualify just because of one person not being on the list. So, as I say, I don't think this is directly London Elect's responsibility, but some sort of more general information sheets of things to expect in the process might be a way forward.
No, anything further? No.
No, absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, so
sorry, just the other question about the security of the nominations.
Yes, no, I think we've flagged that as something
Okay,
that you...
thank
Is that
you.
something maybe Alex can answer just very quickly on whether or not the signatures are checked?
So they are checked. So we have a system that basically, when candidates came to visit Lee and Lauren in the sort of committee room, that part of the work that they were doing was to check the nominee, the electors from each borough who had nominated the candidates, to check that we can find them on the electoral rolls. So that check is carried out. Is there, is it possible that those could be that somebody with access to the rolls would then put somebody down without them knowing? That's theoretically a risk. That would be a risk in any election. Of course, all this information is publicly available, so someone could come along, if necessary, and take the appropriate route through the law courts to say, hang on a minute, that was this was faked. So I mean, we will take, if we find the names on the electoral register, so that is a check that we do make, then we will assume that those names are...
When you're doing that check, you don't have access to the signatures that come, because postal voters have a signature on file at the local authority that is used to check against council nominations.
Yes, just to be clear, we have no access to the signatures on the nomination papers.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an official check.
We take the signatures at face value. That's what we have to do.
Okay. But yeah, thank you.
Finally, coming back to your point about 2024 then, Andrew, if I may, what sort of additional support should be provided by the Greater London Returning Officer to help run a successful mayoral and assembly election in 2024? And you may, of course, want to answer that both in the context of it not coinciding with the general election and it potentially coinciding with the general election.
Well, I think using the existing groups that are set up across London, so the London Election Management Board, which, to be fair, Mary does already, the GLROs have in the past. I think maybe formalising that in some way so that all the heavy lifting isn't just done in one place. If the returning officers across London can be engaged through that group at an earlier part in the process, then they would then be carry some of the responsibility for ensuring the delivery is done, and we can then check in with each other in a more formal way continuously through the process, so that any issues are picked up early and addressed at that returning officer level. I think that would, that would be a sensible way forward anyway, for either whether it's combined or not.
And of course, the whole thing's going to be upon us much sooner than we think, because it's only a 3-year term. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I just want to check, we're running about 20 minutes over our scheduled time at the moment. Guests, are you all able to stay until about 4:20?
Yeah. Okay.
Great, okay, good. We'll just press on and not try to compress the rest of the agenda. So moving on to some further questions for the mayoral candidates from Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much. So this is to the candidates and agent. We've only got the one candidate. We'll ask you first, if that's all right, Richard.
I cannot give up.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't ask Sian any questions. Be a good question to ask, though. Why did you stand, and what did you hope to achieve?
Oh, very good question. I'll try not to be too partisan in my answer here. I stood for this election because I believed that the cause I was standing for was not being taken up by any of the major political parties. I believe that there's a moral responsibility on citizens in a democracy, if they do not feel that their point is being represented, to stand up and actually do so, which is why I stood in this election. My ambition was to make sure that my voice was heard in London, and I feel that the way that the London Assembly elections was conducted, and particularly the surprise party election broadcast, enabled that to happen. In terms of what we achieved out of it, I think I can claim that we won the election in terms of votes per pound spent, because we had no money. But other than that, we got our message across. I feel I was able to put myself in a position where all the voters of London, if they could have chosen to do so, were able to hear what I had to say. And for me, that was all I needed to achieve out of it, and for my party as well.
Thank you. Mark, if you don't mind me calling you Mark, what do you think your candidate, why do you think your candidate stood, and what do you think he hoped to achieve?
I think much of what he said in the booklet probably covers this, but I know that the SDP are a party that people are familiar with from many years ago, and it was about raising the profile of the Social Democrat Party through standing in the mayoral election.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I might go back to you for the moment, Richard. As you know, painfully, you had to pay a £10 deposit, £10,000 deposit.
I've misunderstood something if it was £10.
Yeah. Only 3 of the 20 candidates actually got their deposits back. Regrettably, you would not have been one of those 3, I suspect. Do you think that that 10 grand was worth spending, though, to achieve those goals and ambitions that you had, and or do you think it's too much of a barrier, or indeed not enough of a barrier?
It's a good question. For me, it was money well spent, because at the end of the election, I felt I made as much effort as I as an individual can to have an influence on my society. So for me, that was fine. But as I suggested earlier on, why should my voice count because I can find £10,000 when there's millions of other people whose voices can't count for that? Now, I do appreciate that an electoral ballot with hundreds of people on it becomes very, very difficult to manage. But let's be honest about what it is. It is a barrier to entry, and I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is it a fair barrier to entry? Because I'm sure there are many people who could have spoken far more eloquently than myself on our issue to rejoin the European Union than myself, but didn't have the funds to do so.
But I suspect you will appreciate that there is a cost involved to the authority for every candidate that stands, and of course, what price democracy, of course. But had there been 100 candidates, any figure will do, do you not think that that could be abused if the entry level was too low? And do you not also think that that the message would be confused and that, in fact, your voice would be less heard because you're just one of many.
Well, let's address the cost issue first of all. I don't want to put Alex on the spot here, but Alex, do you have any idea what the marginal cost of the 20th candidate was in this election? The difference between 20 and 19, could you?
No, it's, I mean, as he said, so every candidate, every election does increase the administrative and so on costs, but I mean the difference between 19 and 20, I wouldn't say was necessarily significant. But clearly, there's a big difference on the other hand between 10 and 20, or indeed 20 and 100.
Can you remind us there were 10 candidates in the 2016 election? Or 12? 10?
12, I
12.
think. So this was certainly more than, and you know, for this committee information, obviously, you know, we keep tabs, as you might expect, on the number of candidates that we're expecting, and you know, we had in mind that there could be certainly at least 15 or 16 declared candidates. What happened in the event was, perhaps partly, as we may come on to later, because of the late changes to the nominations process, there were candidates who we certainly had not been aware of at all in the run-up to the election. I mean, the two YouTuber candidates are probably sort of cases in point who came in very late in the day. And I don't know that that's ever been the case at previous elections. I think we probably always had a sense of who candidates were likely to be.
Not the
Keith,
case.
I just wanted to put on record what the increase had been. That's all.
But is it not the case, Alex, that the ideal maximum for the electronic counting is 15, I believe? Is that correct? And then after that, you then get the issues that we had about doubling up on the ballot paper.
There's all kinds of, so we'll come on to this later on. But 15 is the maximum number of candidates you can fit in a single column on the ballot paper. So because there were more than 15, we had to make that very late change to the ballot paper, which of course, you know, we did anticipate as the nomination process progressed. That meant we had 2 sets of double columns, and we'll come on to that later. I mean, there are other, again, which we don't need to go into here. You know, there are, for example, the number of candidates affects the pagination of the electoral booklet. So there are costs there in relation to how many pages the booklet is. So, for example, you may recall that you know, if you stood in 2016, you got 2 pages. In 2021, so that was down to 1 because we didn't have enough paper we wouldn't have had enough paper to print the booklet otherwise.
Okay. Sorry, so
I'm aware I didn't answer the other half of your question.
Yeah,
so, I think it is to be welcomed that more and more people try to get involved in democracy, but you're right, it does leave a challenge. And I'm not aware of exactly how much authority the London Authority has to act individually on this, but there are more imaginative solutions we could come up to for this. For example, looking at things such as primary rounds in elections and that sort of thing. Maybe having certain requirements that parties below a certain level do compete in a primary to get onto the final ballot, that sort of thing. So there are more imaginative solutions that we can come up with without actually cutting down on the number of people who stand. Because I personally think it was really healthy to have 20 people standing. However surreal the experience was on election night, being in the room with 19 of those 20 people, all of whom with very interesting and different views to myself. I thought it was really healthy. The only disappointment was, because of COVID, that we didn't get to have as many debates as we could have done during the course of the election.
Yeah. So do you think it was 10,000 well spent then?
I personally do. I can't imagine many other people are convinced by that, but to me, money well spent.
I'll come to you in a minute, Mark. I just wanted to obviously you had to get the 66 signatures, and as you said, one of the other candidates fell over at that point because they didn't realise there had to be bona fide or whatever. But would the requirement to have made 330 signatures put you off in any way?
No, we were going to stand in the 2020 election, and we were well on our way to get the 10 signatures in each area. I don't know if it was your experience as well, going knocking on doors, but people who aren't going to vote for you are very willing to say, you know what, for democracy, I'll sign to let you actually stand in the election. And recently in Batley and Spen, I had lots of people making the point to me, I'll sign your form, but I ain't going to vote for you, just to get... So I don't think it is a significant barrier, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Mark, if I can ask you the same questions on well, in some respects, of course, as for getting the signatures, you might have had a more of a hands-on experience. But the 10 grand, how does that put your candidate off? Was it?
I think along with Richard, in terms of the number of votes we achieved, probably not very good value for money. But in terms of raising the profile, to get that amount of publicity out to every single voter in London, and then be given the opportunity for political broadcasts and, you know, just constant mention in the Evening Standard and national press, that's what we're looking for, really.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're also forgetting about the Assembly member candidates, which I thought was very, very good value for money.
Yeah, that is.
And much easier to organise as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, bit of a cheeky question, really. What sort of figure would be a barrier, do you think? And where's the marginal?
Well, I think we're trying to get rid of barriers, aren't we, rather than
hope so.
put them up. But I do like your point about it being you're sort of being charged twice over. Yeah.
If you've paid the deposit and you're in the election,
Correct.
then surely at that stage you should have equal access to.
Yeah.
Would there have been a figure that would have deterred you, do you think?
Well, I think for a party like us, and probably yours as well, 10,000 was a barrier.
I will tell you a slight anecdote on the list. I actually misread the list and I promised I'd pay the deposit because I thought it was 500 rather than 5,000.
Yeah.
And when I noticed it was 5,000, it was a bit of a gulp moment, but we found it. I think for our party and our organisation, if it had been higher, we could have worked harder to try and get a little bit more money to actually finance it. But it is about, and certainly for individuals putting themselves forward, I think you're right at the limit in terms of that.
And just finally then, Mark, on the number of signatures, is that an issue for you?
No, getting the signatures from the London boroughs is very, very important. And obviously we mainly used our membership role for that, you know, rather than literally knocking on people's doors.
Yeah.
Although some people said you could do that, and, you know, like you say, you could talk to somebody said talk to a shopkeeper and get their signature, because a lot of them will support democracy even if they don't support your party. All I was concerned about with the signatures was just the security issue, that was all. And I agree that there were checks on, you know, their being on the electoral roll, matching the electoral numbers, matching the address, but that was an administrative check rather than an actual in the flesh check.
Fraud, yeah.
And knocking on someone's door in Upper Street, Islington, and saying, "Is this your signature here, sir?" Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Happy with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to further questions from Assembly Member Bakari.
I'm going to refer these questions to Mary and Alex, if I may. The voter turnout in 2021 was 42% compared to 2016, 46%. Are there any measures that could be implemented to improve on that previous record? And also, could you give me a bit of a breakdown perhaps on postal voters and the impact that's had, whether there was an increase or decrease in that?
I'm going to ask Alex to go first on that.
Fine. So, in terms of turnout, I mean, maybe worth, and again, I think we had some of this discussion at the Oversight Committee in the past. Well, I mean, I'd venture to suggest the turnout was maybe a little bit higher than some people had been predicting, given that the election was happening in the COVID pandemic. You know, given what the sort of opinion polls were saying. So one, it's a good thing that perhaps we hope that people felt comfortable going out to vote in polling stations. But also, to come on to your postal votes point, we anticipated that with the election happening in the pandemic, that postal vote numbers would increase. Andrew will recall we sort of spoke to boroughs, and there were one of the interesting things about this is that in some parts of the country, postal vote levels are much higher, and even within London boroughs, Andrew probably knows the figures. There are significant variations, but what's clear is that there's a trend that they increase, you know, at every election, and they increased here as well. Not to the huge amounts that some had been perhaps thinking back in January, when of course you recall infection levels were so high, and people wondered, again, it's hard to imagine when you're in that situation, January and February, looking ahead to May. Well, are people, of course, obviously by the time we got to May, we were in a relatively comfortable, if I can put it like that, stage of the pandemic, and people were kind of coming out. So postal votes were a big part of the picture. We anticipated that, planned for that. It's another reason why, going back to the earlier discussion of budget, that costs increased, because there are costs relating to the provision of extra postal votes, and we had to allow for that, even if all those postal votes weren't going to be used. What it's a can't fail. You can't have a situation where you run out of postal ballot papers. So turnout. I think we said some papers. So I think it was maybe the third highest of the elections we've had so far. So again, we're always keen to think of ways that turnout can be increased. And this year, as with previous campaigns, we had ad campaigns, marketing campaigns that hopefully you may have seen or heard on the sort of radio or indeed on buses. Some of the things that we sometimes have used in the past to do heavy lifting, for example, tube adverts, were clearly going to have much less traction this time round. But we worked with the Electoral Commission, who have a budget for these things as well, to sort of look to raise awareness and turnout. And I think the marketing information we have suggests that sort of awareness and turnout was pretty high. We're pretty good, all things considered.
Was there any campaigning or work that you think may have helped in increase the diversity of the voters? And are you confident that the electoral roll for the Mayor of London and London Assembly elections actually reflected London's population? I'm quite interested to know not just about ethnic minorities in terms of voter turnout, but also other minority groups like disabled voters and even blind and partially sighted voters. For example, in Norfolk this year, they've been trialling a process of actually helping blind and partially sighted voters. Have you got any kind of evidence of that particular area?
I'd say a little bit about that. I mean, firstly, broadly, if you look at, and we can share figures, if you look at sort of figures of sort of turnout in relation to boroughs, I mean, there is a broad, literally sort of boroughs of with higher levels of deprivation, which are also typically boroughs with higher levels of black or Asian or ethnic minority people. The turnouts will tend to be lower. So there's a kind of broad kind of correlation there. In relation to partially sighted people, there's actually again one of the lines on the GLA budget relates to tactile voting devices, which we send to every polling station in order to enable blind or partially sighted people to vote independently. And you have to make them specially for each ballot paper. So this time round we had one that was double column so that people can place, it's basically a piece of plastic with holes cut out with those, so you can work these out. Of course, at their discretion, it may be that individuals and polling stations help individuals as well. Also, we're saying we do translate the sort of key election documents into other languages, 20 languages, I think, from memory. So, not every language that's spoken in London, but most of the sort of largest ones. So the information is there. I think there's always more you can do, and it's something we'll continue to look at with our colleagues in the marketing and communications to ensure that as many people are able to have access to or feel empowered to vote as possible.
Glad to see that you're thinking about it and improving on it, but I'd be quite keen to know if you want to follow Norfolk's example of using an audio player. And would that be something that you would consider? Because, according to the RNIB turned out report, they've said that about half of the blind and partially sighted voters are using the postal vote approach, and about a fifth of blind voters say that, only a fifth of voters who are blind say that they can actually vote independently. So there's still quite a lot of work to do in this particular area. Would you consider going down the audio route?
Well, I think Andrew may know a bit more about this. So I think we certainly would be something we'd want to look at. I think there's something at the moment, I forget whether it's legislation or guidance, that says that the way that we give effect to enabling the blind or partially sighted to access polling stations is through this tactile voting device. But there is perhaps a question to be asked about whether that is necessarily the best way of doing it and whether other ways should also be made available. Now, it feels to me like if the charitable organisations or the organisations that understand the needs of the blind and partially sighted best are recommending certain ways forward, I would say that's what we should be looking at, with, of course, the inevitable caveat
I'll
that we need to
definitely recommend you
understand
reaching out
cost.
to the RNIB, because
Yeah.
I think they've got some really good evidence to say that there can be a real increase in vote, particularly with that group. And I'd offer that to you. Would that be something you'd consider doing?
Yeah, but like I said, with that caveat that, of course, we need to understand what the cost implications are.
I'll just come in on that. Is that okay? So yeah, I mean, my understanding is that Norfolk pilot was a government pilot. That the law is about to change in this area. So we should, part of the elections bill, we should see this changing in the future, because I think there's a recognition that the current tactile voting device isn't necessarily fit for purpose. So this is something that will be introduced nationally, I suspect, very soon.
All right, thank you.
Before we move on, I just want to note that we've got another set of questions within this section and we've already reached the end of the time limit. So I just want to ask, in particular, Alex, sorry, if you can keep your answers as short as you possibly can for the rest of the meeting. I realise there's lots to talk about, but if you could just really summarise, that'd be amazing. Right, moving on to questions from Assemblymember Cooper.
Can I just follow up? Remember I said I wanted to just follow on. I'm glad you asked those points about people with visual impairments and how we can make sure that they are able to vote. But I've actually been told of at least one instance where someone in a wheelchair had to fill out their ballot paper in the street and pass it to somebody else to put it into the ballot box. It had to be brought out from the polling station. I don't think that's appropriate. Can we be absolutely sure that all of the polling stations are fully accessible for all Londoners to get into? And I know that some of them were changed at the last minute because of the COVID arrangements. Is that something that is definitely being looked at?
Could I come in there, Chair? I think so. This is absolute duty on returning officers, borough returning officers across London to have accessible polling stations. Andrew may want to comment on it. As you say, there were some last-minute changes to polling stations on this occasion, but I absolutely agree with you, and I'm sure Andrew will agree with you too, that example really is unacceptable if that's what people are being asked to do. Now, there may have been a very good reason for it because of sort of COVID-related change to a venue, but in normal terms, a huge amount of work's been done to make polling stations accessible, and that duty lies with the boroughs.
And I think the other thing that was clear from the, we talk about the overall turnout across the whole of London, but it's obvious that different parts of London had very differential turnouts. So, for example, in Merton and Wandsworth, the turnout in 2016 was 50%, and this time around it was 47%, which is considerably higher than the figure in some other boroughs. So are we making special efforts to ensure that boroughs where turnout has been lower, whether that's, for whatever reason that is, to make sure that turnout is improved?
So I think this is exactly the type of conversation we should be having, as Andrew said, through the London Elections Management Board, as we take the lessons from 21 into 24. And just thought it might just be worth taking the opportunity to say that there's the chair has changed of that board, and I'm meeting the new chair of that board, this coming Monday to start conversations about 2024.
Okay, well, no doubt that's something we'll want to hear a bit more about then in due course. We've touched on the £10,000 cost for standing, which gives the mayoral candidates access to significant media and political exposure. And also we've just mentioned the fact that the number of signatures was reduced. Do you think this encourages candidates to enter for publicity purposes only when they know that perhaps there's got absolutely no chance of winning? Is this really healthy, or does this lead to an excessive number of mayoral candidates standing this time around and potentially into the future?
Is that to me, that question?
Yes,
Assembly
it
Member?
is.
I'm not sure. From an administrative point of view, I think that there's no doubt. I think that some of those changes did end up mean that we ended up with 20 mayoral candidates. I guess I'm not dodging the question, but I think our job, Alex and my job, is to then administer the election that we end up with.
I mean, I don't know whether anyone else wants to comment on that. We've got both a candidate and an agent. I know you said that £10,000 is a significant threshold, but it clearly wasn't, because we had 20 candidates, which is the largest number that we've ever had. And £10,000 seems like a pretty good deal for the amount of publicity, including the party election broadcast that you just referred to.
I think we should have some respect for those people. I'm not talking about myself here, but there's a lot of people who struggled a lot harder than myself to come up with that 10,000 because they had a message that they thought it was important for Londoners to hear. And at the end of the day, and again, I'm not trying to be party political here, but you, as the big four parties, you have credibility because you allow other voices to be in elections. And I think that's really important for the health of our democracy. And I would also say, one of the reasons I think that we had turnover higher than 3 other non-COVID elections was because of the variety of candidates and the variety of voices there that to a certain extent counteracted some of that there. So I would argue that the 10,000 is a significant barrier, and those people, and I spoke to some of the candidates at the election, some people had struggled really, really hard to come up with that 10,000 in order for their voice to be heard. Now, other people may not feel that their voice carried any weight, but I think that's something to be respected.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mark?
No, I think that's spot on, Richard. Really is.
So drop it to 5,000 and have 40 candidates next time.
I don't think it would be that. I cannot believe that someone who's prepared to say 5,000, to put 5,000, would not try that extra effort to get 10,000. If you want 100 candidates, drop it to 20. Yes, that would be. But no, going from 5,000 to 10,000, it just means there's 15 more families that aren't going to have a holiday this year because their family member decided it was more important to have their voice heard in their democracy.
I would also say, assuming the signatures are genuine, sorry to keep labouring the point, assuming the signatures are genuine ones, then that is a barrier. Getting 66 signatures from 33 London boroughs is not that straightforward if you're standing as a kind of a publicity conscious candidate, because you may not have contacts in every London borough.
And can I just add to your point there? Yeah. For a lot of those other candidates to actually make that, you cannot deny that someone who's prepared to go to 33 boroughs and knock on doors in 33 areas is not trying to do something to get their voice heard in our democracy. What other role for the publicity they got have they actually benefited from? They've made their voices known. I mean, none of them are going on "I'm a celebrity" after this or anything like that. It's all about getting their
more's the pity
out.
Well, I think it's probably too soon to say whether or not that might take place. But I mean, previously the number of signatures was 10 per borough, so you had to get 330. Would you not agree that that's still an incredibly small number of signatures to gather? 330 is what percentage out of the complete number of voting Londoners? It's a tiny percentage.
It is, but then you might as well just have the entire election by knocking on doors if you're going to make it a significant proportion of the electorate.
Well, some people in this room who probably think that actually that's what the whole of the election was about. I know that the whole of my election was about knocking on doors.
But if you've got on the tube to go to the furthest borough from you in London and you've knocked on doors for 2 signatures, you're not going to stop knocking on doors for another 8 signatures to actually do it. So the people who are determined to get to the area for the 2 signatures, they will go on for 10, they will probably go on for 20 as well. I was particularly nervous in this environment because I was thinking every door I'm knocking in, am I taking the risk of transmitting a virus from that door onto the next door? So I really do credit the decision to reduce it to 2. I thought that was a very, very sensible thing to do. But I think it is a barrier, but it's an enthusiasm barrier. And I think it's one that's worth keeping as an enthusiasm barrier because I think it does give us genuine people who who want to
But is it a
contribute.
barrier or is it just a hurdle to make sure that people are really serious about wanting to put themselves forward?
Fair comment. I think hurdle is a
I'm
better.
not sure I would actually see it as a barrier.
No, I think hurdle in that context is a better word.
Okay. And now this is one for Mary, I think. Does the evidence that you've heard from key stakeholders and also our guests today raise any issues around ensuring fair and balanced coverage of the mayoral candidates during the 2021 campaign? And does the GLA have any powers at all to influence this?
So what I've heard hasn't given me any qualms, because I think people have talked very positively about their experience, recognising though we've got two players from a larger field in the chamber. It's our job to raise awareness of the election, not of the individual candidates. So. But I have to agree with a panel member who said, I think that, the number and variety of candidates that we had this time, I think did attract more media attention. And I suspect candidates benefited from that, and particularly perhaps some of the candidates from the smaller parties that might not have got so much coverage in previous elections.
I mean, some of the candidates, I think, who weren't necessarily even from parties, but were sort of more about... I mean, there seemed to be several candidates this time around who had quite a lot of their own resources and were advertised absolutely everywhere. 3 billboards on the outskirts of Ebbings, Missouri had nothing on some of the candidates who I came across on billboards all over Ebbings in Merton and Ebbings in Wandsworth. I mean, do you think that was still fair? Do we get the balance right there? I do wonder whether those people who had huge resources, possibly more resources than some of the organisations being characterised by Richard as the larger or the main parties.
Well, there are caps on what candidates can spend, aren't there? That's what regulates this area. And while the caps are what they are, there are people who are going to spend at the top end of that, and there are people who can afford to spend nothing. Like, I guess that's the system that we're in.
I guess so. Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Have we had the spending returns published yet? I ought to know the answer to that.
No, I think they're still. I think we're just at the deadline now. We've had a rush of them in over the last couple of weeks. I know that they certainly haven't been published yet, but maybe you can confirm that to you separately, Chair, in terms of the timetable.
Yeah, it'd be useful to, like you say, to
We're
compare
at
the
the
spending.
statutory notice that has to appear in the papers. I'm not looking at Lee, is appearing or has appeared, and the deadline was last week. And so, again, the papers so people can see the returns if they like. We've got them upstairs, and then they're forwarded to the Electoral Commission. So we don't play any role in examining those returns. That's a function of the Electoral Commission.
It's when they're available. Just from what we've been talking about, it'd be interesting to know what proportion of the overall amount spent by each candidate, the £10,000, was, if that makes sense.
I think it would also be interesting to see the expenditure from some of the candidates and do a calculation of the amount spent versus the amount of votes received.
Well, obviously, we all do that.
I think
And I'm definitely in favour of that calculation being published.
But in terms of our interest in what's compare with a barrier or a hurdle, that the proportion of how much everyone spends.
I also think it's an important point in terms of the democracy and the point that I was just asking about the fairness of the election, because I think some people probably threw a lot of money into it, and I'm not actually sure they came out with a large number of votes, but will have got a lot of publicity.
Yeah, I agree. And I also really like the concept of an enthusiasm hurdle. It's almost a fairer way of judging. I like that. Anyway, we need to move on. We've got to... Oh, sorry, Keith. We're really short of time now. We're about 10 minutes each for the last two sections.
Very quick question.
Go for it.
Thank you. Mary, just a very quick one. We've obviously been talking a lot about the mayoral candidates and their promotion and so on and so forth. But how do we promote the London Assembly as part of these elections? Because it does seem that quite rightly in some respects, the bulk of the coverage is around the mayoral candidates. but you know, the Assembly, we believe, obviously plays a very important role, and we are quite, or not very well known, let's put it that way. And how do we, is there any way we can bolster promoting the...
Assemblymember Prince, I think that's covered by question F in the next
Then I'll withdraw it, if you think it is.
That is certainly part of what I was planning to ask
Then I'll
about.
withdraw the question.
And it is a little bit of a change of subject from what we
Yes,
just
no,
talked
that's
about. Great. Moving on to rejected ballots, e-counting and understanding of the voting system. We're starting with Assemblymember Cooper here. And like I say, we're really short of time now, so if you're answering, just answer as quickly as you can.
So rolling up together the figure for people who either didn't use their second preference vote or voted for the same person twice, using their first and second preference vote for the same person. This was much, much higher than usual, than it's ever been before in any of the previous elections. Do you think the fact that the format had to be changed to have 2 columns so that they could still, the ballot papers for the mayor still go through the electronic counters, because you can't accommodate more than 15 candidates, and therefore we had to default to having the 2 columns. Do you think that has affected why there were so many people not using their second preference or wasting their second preference, if I can call it that? And this is for Mary, I think, to start with.
Yes. So I don't think any of us are in any doubt that the format that we ended up having to go with did have an impact on the overcounting and other issues in the on the ballot papers. We can't be any doubt about that, I don't think. I mean, as we know, we've always had a problem with rejected ballot papers over time, and but the extent of the change this time must be something to do with that ballot paper design.
Thanks, Chair.
Excellent. Yeah, there's 2 separate questions here, just to be really clear. One is people not using their second preferences, which is they're entitled to do, but they're not doing it, are they? You know. And then there's a second question of rejected ballot papers, where people are voting first twice, which is the question. So I think Assemblymember Bakari is now going to ask about that second question.
I did want to talk about that aspect, but also there was the other aspect of not just the mayoral vote, but also the London-wide Assembly vote being impacted by that too. And do you think there might be an argument maybe to make that a bit clearer? Because, you know, one minute we're saying London-wide, the next minute it's list. Does that confuse voters? And do you think that could have been made more clearer, maybe for next time, voters being able to know exactly who they're voting for in the list, London-wide, etc., just making it a lot more clearer?
Yeah, so again, let's try to keep this. We did a lot of work with the Electoral Commission in the run-up. Remember, in the run-up to 2020, to try and think about how clear this could be and what changes we should make. So we were ready with, the sort of joint view with the Electoral Commission about, what was as clear as possible. Then, of course, we get into the double column ballot paper, which I think then knocked for 6 some of the improvements we had hoped to see in fewer rejected ballot papers. And I think there was one glimmer of light from this, because, clearly for me, this was the deep disappointment of the election. The glimmer of light, though, is that there was a better use this time of second preferences in the mayoral election than there has been previously. So the number of second preference blanks dropped this time. But that sort of got masked by the significant problems with overvoting.
Okay. Chair, I think you want to carry on.
Did you also have a following question?
I'm going to let you carry on, because I know you've got a lack of time.
Great. Okay, yeah, so we also looked at this issue in the last election, like you say, Mary. We were very concerned that people were misvoting, but also not using their second preferences or not seeming to understand it. So we recommended that there was additional research to test voters' understanding further, and look at the ways in which you might promote it. So you're saying, Mary, that you did do that work with the Electoral Commission. You came up with clearer wording this time. Where was that wording actually used, though? Where did people see it?
Well, so again, I'm not the best person to talk to the detail of this, but pre-2020, we did some work with the Electoral, before we even knew about COVID, we did some work with the Electoral Commission along the lines of this recommendation. I think some changes were made. I think some of the changes to the postal vote pack were made, but other changes, it was ultimately the Electoral Commission's view that we should leave them unchanged because they would become more confusing than they already were. So there was that piece of work done. Then when we found ourselves with a double column ballot paper, as you all understand, very short notice, we then did a lot of work to make sure that all of the material, the election booklet that went to every elector, the advertising that we did, particularly the social media advertising, all was focused on how to mark up this double columned ballot paper. So there were 2 sets of work done.
Okay, that's really useful. Being as how seeing advertising these days isn't a universal thing. I think Alex has mentioned a couple of times, like the tube adverts, which everybody will see as they go about their daily lives, is something you'll see. Online advertising, we might not have been able to observe it. I certainly didn't myself observe any online advertising explaining this ballot paper to me. So I wonder, could we get a full breakdown, examples of every bit of advertising that was done with information on where it was placed? With the actual visual, not a list, but the actual visuals showed to us.
Yes, very happy to do that. I mean, we've done a full evaluation of the marketing work,
Yeah.
and we can provide that with samples of all of the different advertisements.
Great. Now, ahead of time, this is February 2020, the Oversight Committee, a report was provided to the Oversight Committee about the marketing campaign and what the plans were, and that was really useful. But it seems to me like the research that was undergone as part of that, there was £10,000 of the budget went on research. It seems to have been, it's described as creative research to see how effectively the messages are conveyed. And certainly from what we saw of the advertising campaign, it was very good. It was a post-it note. It was clearly a reminder to go and vote. That if your goal was to remind people that the election was happening, that was an effective marketing campaign, and that research would probably have established that. In terms of actually advertising to people and showing people the detail of what the ballot paper would look like, that wasn't the goal of the advertising campaign that was outlined to us in 2020, and doesn't seem to have been particularly used, certainly not on the tube adverts that I saw, on the bus stop adverts that I saw. They were all just reminding you of the date. So what we want to see is this breakdown, so we can tell how much advertising was done that was actually genuinely trying to communicate the difficulties of this. I wouldn't have been surprised to have seen ballot papers on bus stops really showing these, so you could stay and study them, but this didn't seem to happen.
So I was going to say, I think it's best probably to provide the breakdown with the samples, but of course, by the time we got to 21, not only were we reminding people of the date, but we were also trying to persuade people that polling stations would be safe places. And we did some work around the double column ballot paper, but that wasn't on buses or on bus stop shelters. Most of that was social media advertising, because again, there was very little footfall at the time. So different channels and media were used for different messages. But I think we can lay all of that out for you.
Yeah, that's really useful. So you went from one message, which is essentially reminding people, to 3 messages about safety and the ballot paper as well, and presumably you weren't able to do much testing on those extra messages that were last minute.
Because we didn't have the time.
Okay, that'd be really, really useful to see. On the ballot paper, the double columned ballot paper, now I see from the report that's been tabled to us today, it does say in section 5.2, London elects had not envisaged a situation in which it was likely there would be more than 15 candidates. So it suggests to me that you weren't prepared with a 2-column ballot paper, or one that had been tested for comprehensibility. And this worries me, because obviously as a candidate you're given this guidance that says we require you to produce 2 versions of your booklet, and the second version, the 1-pager, is only to be used if there are more than 15 candidates. So we're all expected to prepare an absolute 100% contingency and submit it. but you weren't ready with an alternative ballot paper format if there were more than 15 candidates. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. So we, as I said, we've never had more than 12 before. We knew we could accommodate 15. We were working on, the old world with the old number of signatures and current, as Alex said, this type of basis where we broadly knew who was going to stand. So we moved to the double-columned ballot paper as it became clear to us late in the nominations process that we were going to tip over the 15. But, for a while we didn't know whether we were going to or not. But when it became clear that there was a real risk of that, we then worked with the Electoral Commission and consulted them on the double ballot paper format. We couldn't do anything other than that because, as you know, the A4 format, we had to stick to the A4 format because of the e-counting machines.
And I hope you do appreciate my point, though, that all of the candidates here were legally required to submit a one-page version of their booklet because of this contingency, and that you probably should have had something ready for this contingency as well, given it's something as important as the ballot paper.
With hindsight, we should have done.
Okay, and next time you will? Or is there other options, like adjusting the way the count process works so that it can take a longer, less confusing ballot paper?
So top of my list for what we will do differently in 2024 is find ways of building in greater flexibility around ballot paper length and design.
So there's no fundamental restriction with the e-counting process to having a one-column ballot?
Well, there has been to date in the way that's been contracted and discussed. I think nobody's ever thought, what if?
But
now we're in that discussion about 2024. We're absolutely talking what if.
Okay, great. And you're confident that technically they can accommodate that request into the new contract?
Well, that's the discussion we're in now.
Okay.
But I think, given everything that's happened in 21, it's a really important flexibility that we need to find a way of maintaining.
Okay, well, keep us informed about that, and we'll probably have further questions about changes you'll make to the format to make it more legible, because although we don't want really, without visual aids today, we can't really have that conversation, I don't think. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next section now to try and be efficient, if that's all right. Do any members have any further questions? Okay, great. So the final section is about the 2024 election. We've discussed quite a lot of things today about what changes will you make to what you do for the next election in the general terms. But my first question, I think probably is for Mary again, is how likely do you think it is that the next elections for the London Assembly and Mayor in 2024 will be at the same time as a general election? And if they were, what would the operational impact be?
So I think we have to think of it as a distinct possibility.
So your contracts and plans will taking that into account?
And I think it'll be incredibly difficult. So in fact, if you look back, as you all have, at your 2016 report, you were thinking then, goodness, 2020 is going to be a combined year and it's going to be a nightmare. Well, we have dodged that one, but it's definitely, I think, something we've got to plan for 2024. And that's a big, Andrew's already said it, that will be completely different order of planning and collaboration with the boroughs. I think, and we're going to have to continue to plan for that until it's happened before, and then we can drop the plans.
Andrew, if I can come to you, if I recall correctly, the last time we talked about this, the consensus from boroughs was essentially that this would be almost impossible to manage a borough-led constituency general election count alongside everything that goes along with a completely different kind of election for London. Is that still your view this time? Obviously, this wasn't necessarily your view that you gave us last time.
I think it would be incredibly difficult, and actually even more difficult than it would have been in 2020 had it happened, because we will also have new parliamentary boundaries having effect for the first time at that poll, and potentially a whole raft of other bits of legislation like voter ID and changes to the number of people that can register as overseas electors and things that take over our lives when we're running a general election. So adding a GLA on top of that, putting those things together, it will be hugely significant and very, very, very challenging indeed.
So just a quick supplementary, if I may, on that point. Is it not the case that some people can vote in a general, but maybe not in a GLA, and vice versa? Is that
Currently, that's correct. So EU citizens can only vote at local elections. So a GLA election counts as a local elections, but that's also an area that the elections bill might be looking to address, because there may be changes to the franchise for EU citizens as well, and those arriving after the 1st of January of 2021, and whether there's reciprocal arrangements in place with various EU states. So there's lots of potential added complexity to the process. And yes, there will be franchise differences across both polls.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other risks to delivering the 2024 elections that we need to be aware of from any of you, other than this risk that it might occur at the same time as the general? Mary, you have your hand up.
Yes, I have one other big one, and again we've touched on it, but probably we just need to land this. So I was going to mention, of course, the reform that's going through in the election bill. Andrew's touched on that. That will also be significant. But the other thing is this: I am not sure whether or not the mayoral election will still be a supplementary vote election or a first past the post election.
We have a question about that specifically coming up.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
We do plan to ask you about that. We hadn't forgotten.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay, so that for me is a big risk for 2024 as well, because...
Yes, it is. It is.
They're thinking about what the impact of that has on how we count, and the impact that has on our procurement processes is really important. And it's less than 3 years already, and there's no sign that government's going to legislate for that anytime soon.
Member Cooper, do you want to carry on with this line of questioning about the practicalities of when we sign contracts and when they change the rules and all of that?
I wanted to ask a bit about the first past the post situation.
Yeah. Ask what's different.
Okay. I mean, what do you think the anticipated impact of the adoption of first past the post for the mayoral and assembly elections might be? I mean, presumably that would be all 25 assembly members and also the mayor. No, because, well, as I understand it, and I think Alex will hopefully reinforce this, is that this change comes because it is a change the government is planning to make to how police and crime commissioners are PCCs,
elected.
yeah.
PCCs. So, of course, the mayor is London's PCC. That's how the mayor gets caught up, the mayoral election gets caught up in this potential move to first past the post. As far as Alex and I can ascertain, there are no planned changes to the basis for any of the other elections. So either, of course, the constituency member or the London-wide member. This is all about just the mayoral election because it comes down the PCC route.
Are you sure that's the case? Because I thought some people were talking about the idea of going back to having a representative from each of the London boroughs and the city, so there would be an assembly of 32 or 33 individuals, all elected on a first past the post basis. And I just wondered, do you think there is widespread public interest in this and people campaigning to change the mayor or the assembly in this way?
I guess all we can say at this stage is that when we spoke to the relevant officials in the Cabinet Office, that their understanding was that this did not relate to the London Assembly. Now, clearly, in due course, we may or may not see an election bill, and that bill may then have things that we expect to see or don't expect to see. Certainly, it was all news to us that the government was suddenly planning to drop the second preference vote. But there are definitely no plans of which we're aware of, which government have made us aware, that relate to this affecting the London Assembly.
I mean, what do you think the driver is for making the change to first past the post? I mean, the driver outside of London in certain of the Police and Crime Commissioner elections seemed to be that the turnout was very low, but the turnout for the mayoral election in London has been, as we know, above 40% and somewhere towards 50% more usually. So that seems unlikely to be the driver? Or you don't understand what the driver might be?
It's a question you'd have to ask the government sponsors, which, as Mary alluded to, I think was indeed Priti Patel and not the Home Secretary and not the MHCLG or the Cabinet Office.
When the system first came in the year 2000, there was a referendum that preceded the Act, and so Londoners as a whole voted on the changes to the electoral system. Do you think it would be appropriate for any further changes to be subject to a further referendum of Londoners if we're going to change the electoral system in London? I'm asking that to both Alex and to Mary. Mary might want to start.
Well, I don't think it's a question for us, Assembly Member. I'm afraid. You're right. You reflect correctly. Of course, it was all subject to a referendum originally. This would be quite a big change, and government will need to decide whether or not they're going to legislate for that directly, or give the people of London a choice about it.
Well, perhaps it would be a matter that in Parliament only London MPs would be voting on, and only those members of the Cabinet who are London MPs themselves. Moving on to the count, which took place over 2 days rather than one, to allow for the social distancing measures this year. Are there any lessons that we learnt from spreading it out over the 2 days? And do you think we might actually keep the 2-day count in 2024? Obviously, for those of us who had to wait until the second day, that probably isn't necessarily something, we might all sort of jostle to be on the first day to find out the result. But I just wondered, is that something that you might be looking to keep?
I certainly want to think about keeping it, talk to everybody about how they felt about it. Big, interesting conversation with the boroughs. The whole thing did feel a little bit more under control, doing 7 and 7 rather than trying to do all 14 on one day. As you say, some people had to wait longer than others, but it's interesting. It was driven by social distancing, but I think there are potential benefits of keeping to 2 days. Now, if we get a coinciding election with the general election, of course, all of that we have to rethink anyway. But I'll be talking particularly to borough colleagues in the first instance, and about what we should do there.
Yes. Did you have any thoughts at all, Andrew, on it being run over the 2 days? Was it something that you thought worked? Or would you prefer to go back to having all of the counts at the same time, assuming, of course, social distancing is not required? And obviously, if it is run on the same day as the general election, then you might have counting agents both doing an electronic count in a large venue in one place, and then lots of counts in town halls going on all over London. So that would be quite stretching for staff, I think.
I really must start playing the lottery, I think. I think colleagues were quite happy with the 2 days, but I think, unlike Canday, breathing space to get everything in order.
Okay. I shall stop jostling for answers to questions and say thank you very much, Chair.
Excellent. I just want to ask one more question to the GLA staff before we move, and I'll just ask Assembly Member Curry to come in a second. In terms of knowing if we are going to switch to a different election system, presumably that there's a last date on which you might press go on the contract, or there's these questions of would it be possible to do manual counting if we had a first past the post system? What's the latest date you need to know before you have to just press ahead with this contract anyway, and you might end up with a lot more sunk costs next time? Is that very soon?
So our existing contract allows for contract negotiations to continue into early next year, so we don't have to take a decision right now. But clearly, and one of the things we'll be discussing with the contractor is this uncertainty. you know, it would make sense, wouldn't it, that we, in the absence of anything else, we proceed on the basis, notwithstanding the discussions, coming back to what Assemblymember Prince said earlier about whether there may be other reasons for having a manual or that we would like them to quote for and advise on an electronic count, but also, of course, it might be interesting to, you know, even if you're having a manual count, as a reminder, the contract also allows the provision of ballot papers and other things, so, you know, you can have variance within that in as much as the procurement allows. So these are all things we'll need to take into account.
If you wanted to change completely, you only have about 6 months in which for the government to make their decision. Okay, that's really useful to know. Assemblymember Bakari and then Assemblymember Prince have some...
I just wanted to know about the cost of this. Essentially, basically, what I'm asking is, does it save you money if London Elect went for the first past the post approach or not? And I'm concerned by that, because if that is an issue, that means that there's an element of, I mean, obviously I'm going to come from a perspective of not wanting to go down the first past the post for obvious reasons, but I am concerned that, you know, that could be a decision based on that. And if it is, you know, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Is that something that would be related to that decision making? Would you say that is something that might be pressured on you because of the fact that there could be some cost benefits?
Well, I would say, I mean, my short answer would be no. I mean, the government takes that decision. You know, we don't influence that decision. We just need to work with it whenever it is, as the chair says. It would be very helpful if we were to have a decision sooner rather than later. And one of the points that we have already been making, will continue to make to government colleagues, is that it makes our planning difficult and risks the creates a greater risk of nugatory expense because we have to plan for this uncertainty. So that's unhelpful. But no, we won't be taking a view one way or another on the merits of one system versus another. I mean, you wouldn't expect us to. We're the election administrators, not the policy makers.
So the question about whether it would save us money, I think that depends on what we do. So, I mean, I can't really see any of this happening because I don't think we're going to get the decision in time. But were we to say, actually, that really means that the balance shifts between counting it electronically and counting manually, then, you know, in theory, manual counting will probably save us money, but at the expense of time and other things. But I think it's probably my view and Alex's view that we're not going to have the decision in any time to really make a decision based on it. So I think we're going to have to assume that move isn't made by 2024.
Yeah, and so to be clear, an electronic count, it doesn't really. I mean, and the savings are potentially marginal. I mean, we'll talk to the contractor about that. For a manual count, obviously going back to what we said right at the beginning, if you think about it as 4 separate ballot papers, well, in the event that it was first past the post, it would be 3 separate ballot papers. So a manual count under those circumstances would be simpler than as at present.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
I could go into a lot more detail with questions about the fact that they all don't have to be separated and things. Anyway, Assemblymember Prince has a final question. I just want to just ask the final words.
Thank you. Just restricting ourselves to the mayoral vote being first past the post rather than second preference. It's a fact, isn't it, that, so I'm going to ask this of you, Andrew, if that's okay. It's a fact that in the whole of the 20 years of the elections we've had, the second preference has made no difference to the outcome of the election, and had we had first past the post, we would have exactly the same result as we had prior, as we had in the system that we've used. But do you think, or would you be able to speak on your colleagues, do you think that if we did have the more simpler first past the post system, there would be far fewer spoilt ballots?
I don't know. I'm not really feel I'm in a position to answer that. I mean, and people are, you know, people are used to a first past the post system, but they're also used to voting in this way for 20 years as well. So I couldn't possibly answer that.
Okay. Can I ask you then, Alex, the same question, but
Well, I'd say, so to state, I suppose, the obvious, you know, if you remove the second preference vote, then the risk of overvoting is reduced. One would imagine, but I mean, you'd have to. The only way you'd find that out for sure would be to have the election. But it's a reasonable supposition.
Overvoting is an issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how significant is that issue, overvoting?
It's always an issue over voting in all polls anyway, to be honest. I mean, yes, to a greater extent, but for council elections where you're electing 2 members, people will vote for 3 or 4, and it's always an issue.
Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Very much, Keith. Just to say, you said it was a fact that the outcome had never been altered. It depends what your outcome is. If your outcome is for 50% of voters to have cast a vote for your winning candidate, then that obviously the second votes do contribute towards reaching 50%. Whereas if your outcome is just to achieve a winner, then so it depends on what you consider the outcome to be.
Well, when I say the outcome, i.e. the person who has won the election.
Yeah, but your winning margin is 50% of voters to have... Anyway, that is the point. I'm just saying, let's not record... I just want to make sure the minutes don't record something as a fact. It's a contentious thing.
Could you just actually... Is it a fact that 50% of the people have elected every mayor?
You reach 50% of the valid votes counted. That's the whole point. Yeah.
You get 50% of the votes that are left in the pot.
Yeah.
You don't get 50% of the votes that have been cast.
Yes, but that is a different outcome than simply someone being ahead. Anyway, there you go. I just wanted to ask the mayoral candidates who we have here today, who I realise haven't had an opportunity to comment on the issues with the ballot paper, whether you have anything to add on that just before we close the meeting, and I'm sorry it's so late.
Try and be very brief. Also, you want to go first?
No, you usually say what I'm going to say anyway, so over to you.
I think that the issue of spoilt ballot papers is interesting because I think we need to distinguish between deliberately spoilt ballot papers, which are people's democratic right, and accidentally done ones. I'd be interested to know how many deliberately spoilt ballot papers there are. And also these semi-spoilt ballot papers. I had a conversation with 2 voters in the election. Both of them said, I want to vote for you twice. And my response was, well, no, don't do that because you'll waste your second vote. And one of them said to me, well, will it still appear on the list as a vote? And I said, well, yes, it will, but I wouldn't do it. And they went ahead and did that anyway. So again, some of it is very, very deliberate in terms of that. So I don't think it's just the design of the ballot paper that's causing this. I think it's also people's deliberate intention. Again, I don't know if it goes back to the original legislation, but wouldn't it just be simpler to have one column of votes, you put a 1 and a 2 in? Would that not eliminate some of the problems?
I'll follow up on that. Just let me get some comment from Mark. If
No,
you
I
have
think that's exactly right. It could be simplified.
So, Alex or Mary, depending on which one of you are the experts on the electoral law, do you have an idea how many deliberately spoiled ballot papers there are, given, or how many are intentionally done from the results that you look at? And are you able to change the way that the votes are cast according to the law to offer people to write 1 and 2 as opposed to 2 X's in different places?
So that's something that was mentioned earlier when you asked about the work that was done with the Electoral Commission after the 2016 election. And I think I might be one of the people who was around who saw some of that. And we, for the panel's information, we did change the way that we described the work as part of that. And part of the work, so I was just comparing the 2016 and 2021 election booklets, and the wording they use is different. One of the things I think we looked at was, from memory, and again, Andrew and others will probably know this has come up before, do you want to change an X to a 1 and a 2? And there are pros and cons, obviously, aren't there? I mean, people just associate elections with X's, so to move to 1s and 2s, while in this particular election it could be helpful, it could also be a source of confusion. So generally the thinking has been to just try and direct people as clearly as possible to the existence of the first and second preference votes.
And then to come to the question of whether it's deliberate or by accident, the cause of the rejection, of course, election law does not allow us to go back and examine those ballot papers or those scans of those ballot papers. So we have no legal right to go and look. I'm not sure whether we would always be able to tell the difference, because I think, again, The panel member is right. A lot of this is, some of this is driven by personal behaviour as well.
Some of it does involve some words written on ballot papers describing why they're spoiling it, though. Quite a lot of ballot papers do that.
I think they go down as actually, there's a word for that in the tables, isn't there?
Voter identified and all the rest of it, but we can't look. We categorise the
Yes.
reasons for rejection, but we cannot go back and look at ballot papers.
But we don't
to
know
get
why people put
insight.
X's. The question I asked before, I don't know if you answered actually, was if you wanted to change it to say 1 and 2, could you? Not should you. I think Alex answered more should you.
You would need a change in the law.
Yeah, so it literally says you have to do it by X's in columns at the moment. Maybe that's something to consider for the Parliament as well. Okay, great. We are done with that section of the meeting. I want to thank very profusely all the guests for coming along today. It's been really, really interesting. Again, obviously, you know, we declare an interest. We're politicians. We're very interested in elections. So that's why we've asked so many questions today. I would like to ask the working group to note the report we received and the subsequent discussion that we made, and we'll consider our next actions in conjunction with the Oversight Committee. I do not have any other business that we consider urgent, and so that is the end of the meeting. Is that, yeah, great. I'll bang the gavel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.